Our next speaker is Dr. Scott Hamilton. He's come down from Lakehead University. You're the head of the department there?
No.
I
shed that job years ago.
He's cleverly got himself out of being the head of the department there, but he's built up the department in many ways. In the new technology, he's increased that dramatically, and he's going to tell us about some of the stuff that they're doing up there.
So depending upon how hard a day it's been talking copper, I should tell you right now, there's no talk about copper here. Instead, I'm going to be talking about some research that I and one of my graduate students have been doing over the last 2 or 3 years, essentially asking this question. Is this just a novelty, or is there actual research value associated with drone photography? And I'm going to go through a series of case studies that address certain kinds of archaeology that address the spatial context of sites within their larger environment, and whether technologies are able to help us imagine worlds that are lost. Now, air photography has a very long history in North American archaeology, but I think it's largely underdeveloped in modern North American archaeology in comparison to other parts of the world. This is a bit extraordinary given the availability of technology in the Americas, and we see some people experimenting with visible light air photography, and some people focusing beyond the visible light spectrum, but it's not very well developed. And here are some examples of very well-known utilities of visible light photography. Most of them you will observe oblique angle using diffuse light and shadow to illustrate the features. Here's one of these famous effigy mounds. We also see people using differential crop growth as a method of documenting the buried deposit. And in this case, cultivation of a field in France is clipping the limestone foundations of this Roman villa and bringing chips of white stone to the surface. And of course, the very famous Maiden Castle in Britain. Now, in Europe, we see a lot of these technologies being utilized to address something that is often referred to in the archaeological literature as the cultural landscape. And this notion of a cultural landscape is almost always envisioned as a landscape that has been significantly modified by human beings. And therefore, the rationale goes that these new technologies that enable documentation of cultural landscape are not all that terribly important in North America because we don't have a lot of monumental architecture. We don't have a lot of visible modification of the landscape. Personally, I think that is a false dichotomy because indigenous cultures are imagining and operationalizing their world as a cultural landscape. They just don't have to build large monuments to do that. And the question that I wanted to ask is whether drones and drone photography and that emerging technology that's associated with remote sensing could be useful to give us data of sufficient scale and resolution in order to address that largely invisible component beyond the site context, to understand the site in its hinterland. And I started thinking about this in a serious way about 15 or 20 years ago when I was doing work in the northeastern plains of what's now southwestern Manitoba. And one of the sites that we fiddled with is a communal bison kill site called the Hokanson site. This area right here on the edge of this wetland is a very dense carpet of bison bones and the small side notch projectile points that were used to kill them. Dense, dense, dense carpet of bone. In this area, in this locality, we located the archaeological encampment, the processing site that is associated with processing the outcomes of a successful communal kill. Now, the question that we had was, how did this bison trap work? How were they able to convince a whole bunch of bison to wander into the edge of this slough and die or get killed? How are the people utilizing the landscape in order to effect this successful kill? Now, this kind of data was not available to me when we were first working on this site in the early 2000s. Even this much, much improved satellite imagery is still not sufficient to really capture the essence of how the landscape was used to capture these animals. We were using these kinds of historic sketches from the mid-1800s to imagine how communal killing was being done. Here is the log and pole corral or pound into which the bison are being driven. Here are the drive lanes with a series of small, inobtrusive dead men, as they were called, that are arranged in a funnel that are being used to drive the animals into the mouth of the trap. And behind the dead men will be people lying in wait. And when the bison come near them, they jump up, yell and scream, and the bison veer away. And essentially, as the animals get close to the trap, the hunters who are coming behind will suddenly stampede the herd. The ones at the back get scared, they start galloping, and that scares the ones in front, and they just start heading to try and get away from whatever scary thing is behind them. Now, in order to make this work, they frequently need to hide and disguise the trap in such a way that the bison, that don't have great eyesight but have a phenomenal sense of smell, don't know they're in trouble until it's too late. And in this circumstance, the hunters are driving the animals across the open prairies into this hidden valley. And within this hidden valley is the trap. So essentially, they are controlling a stampede into a predictable destination. Now, can this kind of model of how historic period bison hunting was done, is that useful as a tool for imagining how the Håkansson site was conducted? Can we develop terrain visualization techniques in order to test this idea? So in 2003, we conducted a lot of mapping using the available technology of that time. That involved using differentially corrected global positioning systems to collect thousands of data points across this open field and in the area of the trap itself. This rectangle defines our survey area. We collected thousands of these data points and then used a GIS to generate an elevation model, which is represented by the false color image that you see here. So the hotter and the brighter the colors, the higher the elevation. The cooler and greener the colors, the lower the elevation. So you can get a much more effective representation of relief and visibility of the trap from these kinds of elevation models. It worked. However, it worked at an enormous cost in terms of equipment and sweat and time. It worked, but could we do it very often? Or could you only do it once in your lifetime, given the availability of technology at that time? This is some of the outcomes from that initial work, where we created the elevation model, transformed it into a wireframe, and then draped the existing air photo on top in order to get a sense of the representation of relief. This is just a standard view from about this location, looking towards where the kill is located. As you can see, the trap is invisible. There's no sense of the valley until one is literally standing right on the brink of that slope, at which point the bison would be stampeded over the edge of the bank, down into the valley, and before you can say, oh goodness, you've got 70 or 80 or 120 bison milling around within your trap. It seemed to work. Now, as technology advanced, I started to think about whether these kinds of models could be more cost-effectively developed using remotely controlled aircraft. So, primarily at the pressure of one of my graduate students, I invested in a plastic play toy. It's a $1,500 to $1,800 plastic play toy that was initially purchased about 2014, and we began by addressing the question, is this a play toy or is it a research tool? We wanted to address what its capabilities were, how easy was it to fly, is it sufficiently idiot-proof for people like me to operate without putting it into a tree, and does it have the photography capabilities in order to catch research quality data. Now, it worked, but the telemetry wasn't great. The camera has a really bad fisheye. And, of course, it wasn't sufficiently idiot-proof, and I crashed it and broke it. It was not a happy day. Here's some of the results of the initial experiments before I broke it. How hard is it to crash? Well, it's not very easy to not crash it, shall we say. The battery life is quite short. You have maybe 15 minutes to 18 minutes in the air, and that drops very significantly if the weather is cold. How far away can the camera and the drone be from the operator before you lose radio signal? What's the image resolution? And most seriously, what's the degree of distortion of the images? And we found that while this is pretty cool, it's not up to research standard. Here are some of the images that we shot early on in the process. Looks pretty good. This is a conventional satellite image. This is a detail of the drone photograph for that particular area. We can see a lot of detail on the ground. When we look at those raw images and zoom in, and then zoom in, and then zoom in again, we can see a lot of detail on that ground surface. Looks good so far. What's the fisheye problem? It's horrendous. It looks pretty, but it is useful as a spatial archaeology tool when the images are that badly distorted. This is a problem. How are we going to get photographs that are representing the surface of the Earth with sufficient precision and accuracy and resolution to be of research value? Clearly, this machine isn't going to cut it. One of the first sites that we actually tried it on is a field school site literally on the university campus. It's probably an archaic age occupation that is right on the former Nipissing Transgression beaches. Here are the Minong age beaches, way back up here with Paleo-Indian sites, and we think these are archaic age sites along the edge of that lower beach. It's right on the campus, an ideal circumstance for running a field school with no money. So we did a whole bunch of work documenting the sites that were being encountered in the forest groves along the edge of this river that run right through campus. Oh, I lied. There is going to be one mention of a copper projectile point right on a Nipissing Transgression beach. How good is that? Now, these are some satellite images, the best available satellite images that I could find, and while they're not bad, they are useful for sorting out some of the important landscape features that seem to be associated with the artifact distributions. They don't give us a lot of detail. So these are some of the images from the drone of that same area. And you can see the detail clip from that image. And there's pretty good quality resolution of the ground surfaces. We could see features from the air that we were walking across and thinking were important for understanding the site. Now, unfortunately, in the heat of excitement of getting this thing in the air and getting to the sweet spot in order to take the pictures, you kind of lose track of how much time has it been in the air. Was that 3 minutes or is that 20 minutes? And one of those things happened. I was so preoccupied with getting the picture, I ran out of battery, and the thing came spiraling out of the sky straight into the top of a poplar tree and broke into pieces. End of my $1,500 investment. So we went back to the drawing board, waited for about 6 months until the technology had improved sufficiently for us to see a machine that has the potential of overcoming the weaknesses of the first machine. So the replacement machine is not that much older than the first one, but over that 6 months, we see a very significant improvement in a lot of the weaknesses that we were seeing with the first machine. The most serious is the lack of fisheye distortion. So I flew over top of a soccer field next to my house and took some pictures of the white chalk lines around the boundaries of the soccer field, held my breath as I uploaded the pictures into my computer, and then laid down some straight lines, and by God, the photograph of the chalk lines actually were straight lines. We can now get serious about using the technology for archaeology. The next one of our experiments was to fly over the reconstructed site of Old Fort William, a Northwest Company fur trade post at the mouth of the Kaministiquia. And this is actually a mosaic of probably 200 images that were flown in a succession of passes back and forth across the site area. And then photogrammetry software was used to stitch them together to create this georeferenced mosaic. Looks fantastic. High resolution, no distortion, really good quality, sharp mosaic image. And best of all, it's already registered in Cartesian space. So this can be used uploading directly into a GIS. And it turns up to be in the right place on the ground. Here are some of the derived products. This is an elevation model produced from the air photo images. Essentially, light reflectance is being used as a means by which to estimate that third dimension, relief variation across the site property. The horizontal, the XY, seems to be extremely accurate. One of the tasks the student has to do is to estimate whether the z-axis relief is actually being represented accurately. And we're going to use these hard edges and hard surfaces of this building to calculate what the actual z-axis is to determine how accurate it is. But the detail that it's picking up is quite remarkable. You can see the edge boards of this raised garden plot. You can see this firewood stack here, right down to the point where you can see the half-depleted stack of birch firewood represented almost like a stairwell going down on this DEM. It can also create three-dimensional models, and you can spin these things and zoom in and zoom out. It's very cool. Even I am discovering my inner nerd in playing video games. You create these things and you play with them and start trying to find the perfect representation of the feature that you're trying to document. All kinds of potential for animation sequences, virtual flyovers, even printing 3D models of archaeological sites. The problem is, conventional academic publication is still kind of stuck in the 1950s and 60s. Illustrations are usually in black and white, or if you're really lucky, maybe grayscale. How are we going to represent these spatial products in millions of shades of color in order to capture the variables we're trying to capture? We also decided we were going to find the worst possible conditions to fly in order to evaluate the breaking point when the technology started to fall short. So we decided we were going to fly a earthwork that Ken Dawson had documented in the 1960s, about an hour and a half northwest of Thunder Bay. So this is Ken's representation of the dog effigy. It's an intaglio earthwork. The body and head and legs of the earthwork are actually depressions, and you can see a raised ridge surrounding the main body of the critter. We went late in the fall, early in the winter, snow on the ground. It was covered with low scrub and grass, and it was in a small clearing surrounded by open forest. There's our flight envelope. Remember, I've just already thrown away $1,500, and the last one hanging it up in a tree. I'm a little nervous about this. It was also cold, which meant we had even shorter time with the battery. So we flew it. I had the good sense to turn the controls over to the graduate student, who is 40 years younger and spent his adolescence playing video games in his mom's basement. Much, much better hand-eye coordination. He flew it like there was no problem, moving in and around all those branches and leaves and spruce boughs. So we ended up with the image, and we looked at it and thought, looks pretty crappy. You'll have to take it as an article of faith that there's actually something there. And thinking, well, okay, so this pretty much demonstrates the critical limits of this kind of technology. So let's see what the derived data, the elevation model and the 3D model look like. Now, I'm not sure if you can see it with the sort of the pixelated screen, but you can see the ridge here representing the lower body of the dog. Here is his belly, here's his front leg, his back leg is back there, here's part of the head. It's been truncated and clipped around the edges because there's too many tree canopy pieces protruding over the clearing to be able to capture all of that imagery. Here is the elevation model, then I've rescaled and reoriented Ken's original sketch and plunked it down on top, and it fits pretty closely. Even under these awful conditions, it seems to work. Now, I then decided that I was going to try it on some sites that I had been doing work on about 25 years earlier on the Kaministiquia Delta just west of Thunder Bay. These are a whole series of lithic scatter sites that are out in the middle of farmers' cultivated fields, either just above the Glacial Lake Minong line, represented by the transition from blue to white. Essentially, they're right along that Minong shoreline. The artifacts mostly consisted of taconite debitage, but there were a few tools that indicated that these sites may well be Paleo-Indian in age. But I have found that many of the landscape features that seem to be associated with these archaeological deposits were too subtle to be represented on any of the available maps. So I thought, well, I'm going to fly one of those fields and see what I can come up with. So here is the knoll that is yielding the taconite debitage that I think is Paleo-Indian. It's no more than 40 to 70 centimeters above the floodplain surrounding it, and all of the artifacts are tightly clustered on that wee sandy knoll. When I walked across it, I could see the knoll. I looked at any maps, any air photos, any satellite imagery. It's not there. Can't see it. Flew the drone over top, created an elevation model, and there's the knoll popping up. That subtle little bit of relief becomes visible using the drone. Now, we very quickly discovered that there are three primary rules, simple rules, for flying a drone for archaeology. Number one, get it into the air. Two, get the images quickly. And get back down on the ground before you do something stupid. Pretty simple and straightforward. but you've got to do it within a 15 to 18 minute flight envelope. That means flying around manually is a monumental waste of valuable battery time. Now, fortunately, with this particular version of technology, third-party software is now becoming available that allows us to set up automatic flight plans. We define the corners of the area we want to survey. We say how high we want it to fly. We say how much overlap between individual images. And we say how fast we want it to fly. And essentially, you save that flight plan. And then when you've got the drone in the air, you launch that saved automatic program. And just like cutting the lawn, it flies these prepared flight paths, capturing all of the information at the standard that you specified. Sounds great. What's the product look like? So this is a satellite image of a ring of rocks that are usually submerged underneath a hydroelectric reservoir in Thunder Bay. The dam is located right here or here. The original river course before the dam is right there, and the rock ring is located on the shore of the original river. The reservoir usually is flooded to this level. So usually that feature is underwater. Now, we found out that the reservoir was being drained for some maintenance of the dam, so we decided to just fly it and see what happens. Here is some of the imagery that we captured. Now, it took us 18 minutes to fly the thing, maybe 8 hours of data processing in the computer. We estimate that it probably would have taken us, a couple of weeks using conventional mapping techniques in order to capture data of sufficient quality to be comparable to this. So it begs the question, can we afford not to use these kind of techniques to document certain kinds of sites? Here's another series of slides of work that is ongoing. This is for research by another graduate student who's assessing the value and utility of sonar finders for documenting the bottoms of lakes. This is another reservoir lake, and all the wee red dots represent archaeological sites that have been encountered along the washed out shores of this lake. We are experimenting at a site here and there. The student is seeking to address whether this quality of sonar technology is good enough to provide research data. But how do you validity test sonar data? What is good enough? And this has been an ongoing problem. Here's what our best guess of what the world looked like on Dog Lake before the flood in the early 20th century. This village reported there is probably right there. This washed out site called Skull Point is located right there. Dramatic transformations of these lake shores. Now, the first pass involved using the sonar to collect some basic bathymetric data. This is what the data looked like once we got it processed. Here is the bathymetry. There's also a bunch of side scan imagery to go with it. The satellite imagery suggested that shorelines were probably originally out at least this far. This is what the landscape looks like when the dam is drawn down to its lowest level. Can't see the ground because of the ice cover. This is when the reservoir is full. So there's virtually none of the archaeological site that's left. This site yields a large number of Paleo-Indian and archaic artifacts. What's going on? What is the context of this destroyed site that might help us explain why these places were being occupied? Now, we've decided that maybe we'll use the drone as the means for validity testing. So we did one flight during early May when the reservoir was drawn down to its as low as possible for that year, and then flew later in June when the reservoir was filled full of water again. Now the question is, where was the original shore? Can the sonar detect landscape features that are normally on the bottom of the lake? This is a detail right there of the lake bottom as it was exposed in early May. Lots and lots of detail. Will the sonar be able to detect certain kinds of features on the bottom? The rock rubble, drowned logs, soft, silty bottom as opposed to rocky bottom. Will the sonar be able to detect and differentiate? That's part of the ongoing work that the graduate students are working on. Now, as I got more and more enthusiastic about the utility of this stuff, I thought, well, maybe I'll go back to some really old data from the late 90s and early 2000s and see if this is going to be an effective way of documenting sites and whether it produces results that are of comparable quality to the documentation produced the old-fashioned way with a lot of time and sweat. So we are particularly interested in this site here, Loughton site, which is probably representing some of the most northerly of plains woodland forager agricultural cultures in the late pre-contact period at their most northerly extent in the northeastern plains. This is the map that I produced using conventional methods back in the early 2000s. This is probably a former wetland through here and through here, and the agricultural village is located on this well-protected high and dry ridge that's surrounded by wetlands to protect it from prairie fires. This is the drone flight of the same basic locality, this area right here. There are some artifacts that come from the photogrammetry process that suggest that perhaps it's not as precise as the conventional approach. But remember, this probably took 12 to 15 days of hard work. This was probably 15 minutes in the air and probably no more than 2 or 3 hours of computer processing. Can we afford not to use these techniques? I've also started experimenting with the use of drones in documenting Indian residential school cemeteries in various places in Western Canada. All of these images are from my first round of work for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the historic records indicated that there is a cemetery in this area and also a cemetery here. I was feeling pretty good about the quality of imagery that I was getting from good old Google Earth, particularly given it's an urban area and therefore there was street view imagery of the locality. So here you can see this cemetery is essentially viewed from street view right there. Pretty good quality, but could we do better? So this past spring, I flew the site again with the drone, and here is the overview area. Here is it blown up a bit, and then this particular cemetery blown up even more. And lo and behold, we can start to see some of the extant features of the cemetery visible from 40 meters in the air. Very important as a planning and prospecting tool for the preliminary rounds of site documentation. I decided that I was going to push it back even further into work that I'd done in the early 1980s in southern Manitoba. And this consisted of a series of sites in this locality of the Assiniboine River Valley, where the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company and the XY Company operated bison provisioning outposts, where they would harvest or trade for bison meat or pemmican and fat in order to provision the canoe brigades. So essentially, the northern plains are being used as a vast provisioning hinterland for the boat brigades. Souris Mouth forts are a series of trade posts that were playing a very strategic role in that fur trade operation. So in the 1980s, my gig was to do a site inspection and documentation, do some controlled surface collection of the sites that were within cultivated fields, and also do a whole series of topographic and geophysical mapping work in order to investigate where the sites might be located in detail. Because it was government work, most of it remains unpublished 30 years later, and I've decided that the hell with it. I'm going to go back and I'm going to reinvestigate those sites, publish the old data after I evaluate whether the drones can improve the quality of the work. So here are a series of Google Earth images showing the posts. There's 3 discrete clusters, the one in the south, one in the middle, and one up here. I'm going to talk about this post. Here's the example of the 1980s maps that we were producing with no GPS, no satellite image, no total stations, virtually no computing power. The best cartography that we had was 1 to 50,000 maps and black and white air photos. And essentially, our working tools were compasses, tapes, and a theodolite. The first question was, will the old data stand up when measured against 2016 data? This is the flight over Brandon House 1. The red lines, the red boxes you see define the geophysical survey blocks. Future work will involve trying to take that 1980s data, superimpose it on top, and see if the drone can detect what I was seeing on the ground, and also whether my mapping and cartography from 1983 was actually accurate. This is an artist's rendering of the site on the basis of the archaeological explorations. This is the drone, probably 40 meters up in the air, looking towards the other side of the river where the other 2 sites are. The Northwest Company post is here at B, and the XY Company post is here. So essentially, during this competition period, the fur trade companies were essentially swamping the landscape with competition in order to try and run the other companies out of business. So in this particular locality, we think there's somewhere between 6 and maybe 8 fur trade posts. We found 4, maybe 5 of them in the dense bush. This is the output from the XY Company operation at Fort Lasouris, and you can see the DEM pretty faithfully captures the elevation high point, this knoll right here, with land tapering away in every direction. The different symbols represent different classes of artifacts that were reported in the controlled surface collection. We can see that there's a pretty tight clustering of artifacts from the most optimal location on top of that knoll. So essentially, we're getting good representation of the old data, but 15 minutes in the air, as opposed to close to a week and a half of cutting brush, collecting data, and probably 2 or 3 weeks of processing that data by hand. This is another one of these sites, and in this case, we see the controlled surface collection represented by the red boxes. The choropleth dots represent the density of European artifact recovery. This is an 1890s sketch of the ruins of the fort as reported by J.B. Terrell when he investigated the locality. Pretty close fit. I'm hoping that I can get access to some 1970s air photography to see if I can refine this data a little bit more. There seems to be a bit of a displacement. Now, the final Sourismouth Fort site is way to the north end. It's out in the middle of the open prairie with none of that overstory of vegetation problem. This is the central cairn right in the middle of the fort that was built and dedicated in 1928, 100 years after the post was originally developed. There is the cairn still there. I've superimposed the topographic mapping that I did in the 1982 season. The red lines represent the grid control area for the magnetic survey. And here's what the elevation model looks like. And to my surprise, maybe it's too much coffee or too much scotch, but I can see some kind of a linear feature here and here and here. I'm not sure if it does well through the projector. I did not see those linear depressions when I did the original work in 1980, but the drone picked it up. We're hoping to refine the quality of this image by filtering out some of these artificial high points, here and here and here, and of course the cairn, in order to give more of a color spectrum range to be applied to the relief change that we think is important. And of course, here's the magnetic data imposed on top of that. Looks pretty promising. Now, another thing that occurred to me was that instead of having to use old data that's 10, 20 years out of date and really coarse resolution, does the drone provide us with an opportunity to collect real-time imagery? So this is an old stone barn foundation out in the middle of a cultivated field. This L-shaped feature is the one I'm going to take a look at. So there it is, the image area out in the middle of this big farmer's field. I was doing all of the documentation from about 300 yards away on the side of the road. This next sequence of shots gives you a sense of the density of image recovery. Now remember, this is generating something like 350 images for the flight mission. And since each one is somewhere between 5.5 and 6 megabytes each, it builds a large data footprint very, very quickly. So you can see already all kinds of architectural features being observed and documented from 300 yards away. A lot of pictures, lots of overlap. And this is what the product looks like. That's what the mosaic looks like. This is what the elevation model looks like, with those obvious features being detected quite nicely. And this is the, I'm such a nerd, 3D model that can be rotated and spun and zoomed in or zoomed out. All of that interpretation is possible from a distance. Now, the final considerations that I want you to think about are, what can you do with 15 to 18 minutes of flight time? Do you really want to invest something like $1,500 to $1,800 in a plastic toy that you might crash on your first flight? And this stuff isn't insurable. Also, that investment rapidly becomes obsolete. And there's all kinds of emerging regulations that make it difficult. But I think that my sense is that the technology is emerging and developing and becoming so sophisticated so quickly that we really can't afford to not utilize this technology and start to experiment with its limits, with this important proviso. You can do something dumb really, really fast. So an important part of the learning curve for archaeologists is to figure out how to minimize the risk of doing something dumb. And thank you. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. Don.
Do you anticipate any new technology involving these drones in the coming near future?
Oh, it's already happened since I purchased this one. This machine only captures visible light imagery.
So what is it you want now for the next stage?
Well, if I could find a bank or a lottery ticket that would win, probably machines with longer flight endurance, cameras mounted on these machines that are able to move into near infrared. I would dearly love to be still in the racket when LiDAR can be mounted on these things, which is coming quite quickly. And probably within a decade, I would like to see geophysical instruments mounted on these things as well.
Maybe they should have a parachute too.
They do have them. Unfortunately, they're on the ground in pieces before you got time to say, oh crap, and hit the panic button. So you have to be really, really alert. Robin.
I think what you're doing, and even just the fact that we're videotaping this, there's going to be so many people across the country that are going to learn from what you guys are. You guys are learning what works and what doesn't work. Because a lot of people are thinking, I want to get into this, I want to use it for archaeology. You guys are actually experimenting, figuring it out, documenting it, and that's going to teach you.
Well, that's how I view it too. I have been releasing a bunch of stupid drone tricks kinds of reports and talking about don't do what we did and here are the consequences kinds of reports and presentations. You already uploaded it onto your website. Now, when I was in Whitehorse at the Canadian Archaeological Association conference this spring, I did a lot of talking with a bunch of other researchers who are thinking about much the same sort of thing. And I think this summer there's probably a fairly substantial number of researchers who are starting to mess around with the technology. But my sense is that most of them are thinking of it as an expensive way to get a low elevation overview view of their site. They're not thinking of it as a research tool, but rather as an illustrative tool. And I think there's that important learning bump as we start thinking about how can this be useful for more than a novelty. And I think that's where most of the research and development's going to have to go is what can we learn about the site and its cultural landscape using these kinds of tools so that it becomes as matter of course as an archaeologist using a GPS unit or a digital camera.
What model are you using?
I'm using a DJI Phantom 3 Advanced, which is probably the least expensive high-grade machine that I could find that overcame the photo distortion problem. If I win the lottery, I probably would very quickly move to machines that are probably 2 or 3 times as expensive as this one, simply because they've got somewhat better capacity. But pound for pound, that little machine that's being designed and marketed to hobbyists is producing pretty damn good quality results. Yeah.
At the Brandon House, you talked about XY and Northwest and Hudson Bay.
Uh-huh.
How do you determine which one is which?
That's the work of the 1980s, and also my subsequent master's thesis research, where I was looking at the distribution of sites and looking at the historic records to try and sort out from those historic records which post was located where. And the archaeological investigations were focusing on essentially doing an audit of the sites. What condition are they in? How vulnerable are they? How big are they? How intact are they? And therefore, all of the mapping operations. We were seeking to maximize the information while minimizing the excavation footprint to make it less obtrusive for looters. Drones obviously serve an important function for that too.
Are those sites protected in any way? Are they?
Well, they're protected to the limit of a couple of bureaucrats sitting in acoustic cubicles in downtown Winnipeg reading memos and sending memos are able to provide protection. These sites are all extremely vulnerable.
Are you sharing feedback to the manufacturers?
No.
Or are they asking for it?
No, I don't think they even know I exist. There are thousands of people who are fooling around with this technology for a whole bunch of different purposes, and they're all clamoring for the machine manufacturers to give them a free machine to play with. They know they've got a seller's market. So essentially, right now they're thinking their primary market is late middle-aged guys like me with more money than brains who want to buy a toy. Very quickly, they're thinking about the commercial application. We see, when you look at a lot of the web literature, you see a lot of people thinking about them as being useful for real estate assessment. There are some people who are thinking about them as being valuable for wildlife management. Other people are thinking about them for environmental impact assessment functions. Agribusiness, this particular company is actually in development of a drone that's got the capacity to first fly a field to find stressed areas in a agricultural field, and then you load it up with fertilizer or pesticides and fly to those precisely located spots and spray the hell out of the spots where the grasshoppers are killing your crop. So that kind of technological innovation is coming very, very quickly. John?
Just some of the new drones now come with collision avoidance.
Yes.
So
So long as you're going forward.
forward, yeah.
Yeah. And so long as the sensors are able to detect whatever that barrier is. Now, if you run it into a hydro line, it's probably not going to detect it. That's part of the new innovations that render the machine I bought less than a year ago obsolete. Now, what will I buy if and when I have to buy the next one? That's a good question, because just like all of this technology, the capacity is going up, the price is going down, and we get caught in a trap very much like late 1980s and microcomputers. Well, I'll just maybe wait for a year when the prices have gone down, and you keep chasing that maybe next year. And I think that, from my sense, we're at the point where you have to bite the bullet and buy your first microcomputer. You know what I mean? Yeah. I think it's good enough now that it's got research capacity.